My name is Alyssa Carter. I am 29 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I owned a small art studio in downtown Chicago, left to me by my grandfather, a man who smelled like turpentine and pipe tobacco and believed, with a conviction I have never found in anyone else, that making something with your hands was the most honest thing a person could do with their life. The studio was called Greystone. It sat on the corner of Maple and Wicker, with wide, north-facing windows that caught the kind of pale, diffused light that painters spend their whole careers chasing. It was not large, it was not profitable in the way my family understood profit, but it was mine, and for 7 years it had been the only place on earth where I felt like a complete person. I was not the favored child, and I say that without bitterness, simply as a fact, the way you might state that Chicago winters are long or that old buildings settle. My brother, Derek, was the golden one, the one my parents introduced first at dinner parties, the one whose half-finished ideas were spoken about at the table with the reverence usually reserved for completed things. He had started 4 companies in 8 years. None of them had survived past the second year of funding, but my parents spoke about each collapse as though it were a strategic retreat rather than a failure, as though Derek were simply conserving energy for the next great attempt. They gave him money with the ease of breathing. They gave me advice with the weight of obligation. I had learned early not to ask for either, and so I built my life the way my grandfather taught me, slowly, carefully, with my own hands. I had been away for 11 days. There was a small group exhibition in Milwaukee, a modest thing, 6 artists sharing a rented gallery space near the lake. I had sold 2 pieces and met a ceramicist from Detroit who made me laugh until my sides hurt, and I came back to Chicago feeling the rare, clean satisfaction of a life that was working. I took the train. I walked the last 6 blocks because the morning was cold and bright, and I wanted to feel it. I turned onto Maple and saw the orange construction netting before I saw anything else, and then I saw the scaffolding, and then I saw that the windows, my windows, the north-facing ones, had already been removed. The contractor was a broad man in a yellow vest who did not seem to understand why I was standing there with my hand pressed flat against the locked door. He told me, with the casual indifference of someone delivering weather information, that the new owners had taken over the day before. He had a clipboard. He had somewhere to be. He was already walking away before I finished my sentence. I called my mother. She let it ring 4 times before answering, which she had never done before, and I understood in that pause that she already knew what I was calling about. She said they did what they had to do. She said Derek had needed the investment, that the timing had been critical, that these decisions were complicated. Then my father took the phone and said the words I will never forgive for the rest of my life. "It's just a studio. You can start over." That's when I realized they didn't just sell my studio, they erased me. I drove to my parents' house the following morning because a phone call was not enough for what I needed to say, and because I wanted them to see my face when I said it. My mother met me at the door with the careful expression she used when she already knew a conversation was going to be difficult, a kind of preemptive composure, like a wall built before the rain. She offered me coffee. I told her I did not want coffee. I told her I wanted an explanation that made sense, a real one, and I watched her face shift from composure to something that looked disturbingly like inconvenience. Derek was there, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, and when I looked at him, he had the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was mildly disappointed it had arrived so soon. He told me I was being emotional. He said it the way people say it when they want to end a conversation without having to win it, flatly, with a small shrug, as though my anger were a weather event he was waiting to pass. My mother said it had been a family sacrifice, that the money from the sale was going into Derek's new venture, that sometimes one person had to give something up for the good of everyone. I asked her when I had agreed to give anything up. She looked at the window. My father said the property had been a complication in the estate, that the paperwork had always been unclear, that they had simply clarified things. That was the word he used, clarified, and it landed in my chest like a stone. I left without raising my voice because I suddenly understood, standing in that kitchen, that arguing with them was not going to give me back anything that mattered. What I needed was not a conversation. What I needed was a lawyer. Her name was Priya Menon. We had been friends since our mid-20s when we had lived in the same building on the north side and shared a habit of reading on the fire escape. She was a real estate attorney now, and she owed me nothing except that she was someone who still believed in doing things right. I called her that afternoon, and she met me at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue with a yellow notepad and the particular focused expression she always wore when she was taking something seriously. I showed her everything I had, my grandfather's will, the trust documents, the deed, the transfer paperwork my parents had sent me a photograph of as if that were the same as transparency. She read for a long time without speaking. The discovery did not come all at once. It came the way most important things come, in pieces, each one slightly more damaging than the last. The property transfer had gone through, but the business license for Greystone was still registered in my name, tied to a clause in my grandfather's trust that could not be dissolved without my direct signature on a specific secondary document, a document that did not appear anywhere in what had been filed. And then Priya found the signature page of the sale authorization, and she set it on the table and looked at me very carefully, and I looked at it, and I understood that the signature was not mine. The loops of the letters were close but not right, the way a copy is never exactly the original no matter how careful the hand. They had also, it emerged, listed me in the supporting documents as financially irresponsible, a characterization designed, Priya explained in a quiet voice, to justify the transfer of control. They had built a paper version of me and used her to take everything from me. I sat with that for a long moment, and I felt something inside me go very still and very cooled, the way water goes before it freezes. Not absence, but compression, everything pulling inward and hardening into something that would hold a different kind of weight. They thought they took everything from me, but they didn't realize what they never owned. Priya filed the injunction on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the construction on Maple and Wicker had stopped because the courts had frozen the transfer pending a full review of the title documentation and the trust clause, and because the investor group that had purchased the property had discovered, at the worst possible moment, that what they had bought was legally contested. I did not celebrate. I sat in Priya's office and watched her work, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, that the ground beneath my feet was something I was choosing to stand on, rather than something that had simply not given way yet. Derek called me 7 times over the weekend. I let every call go to voicemail and listened to them in order on Sunday evening, sitting on the floor of my apartment with a cup of tea gone cold beside me. The messages moved through stages, confusion first, then frustration, then something that was almost but not quite an apology, then a harder edge, then desperation. My parents called twice. My mother's message said only that I should think carefully about what I was doing to this family. My father's said that there were ways to resolve this quietly if I would agree to a meeting. I thought about what quietly had cost me the first time, and I did not return either call. The meeting happened anyway, not quietly and not on their terms. Priya had requested a formal walkthrough of the contested property with both parties and their representatives, and my parents arrived with a man in a suit who kept checking his phone, and Derek arrived looking like he had not slept in 3 days, which he probably had not. I arrived with Priya and a stillness I had been building all week like a structure, something load-bearing, something that would not shake. My mother's eyes moved to mine the moment she saw me, and she looked away first, and I noticed that, and I kept it. My father spoke first. He said I needed to stop this before I ruined my brother's future. He said it in the voice he had always used to end conversations when I was a child, the final word voice, the voice that expected the room to agree with it simply by virtue of its confidence. Derek stepped in before my father finished, and his voice was lower and faster, and he said if I would just sign the remaining document, just make the transfer clean and complete, they would compensate me fairly, they would make it right, he promised. He used the word promise twice in one sentence. I looked at him for a moment, and then I said, calmly and without raising my voice, the only thing that needed to be said. You sold something that was never yours to sell. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the thing that happens when a truth lands in a room, and there is no wall left to deflect it. Priya then laid out with the precise and unhurried clarity of someone who had prepared thoroughly exactly what the legal exposure looked like. The forged authorization, the fraudulent characterization in the supporting documents, the invalid transfer, the potential liability not just for my parents, but for the investors who had failed to conduct adequate due diligence. The man in the suit stopped checking his phone. Derek sat down. My mother put her hand over her mouth. My father, who had spoken in the voice that expected agreement, said nothing at all. I watched their faces change, and I did not feel triumph exactly. I felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. I felt the particular equilibrium of someone who has stopped waiting for permission and started simply knowing what is true. For the first time in my life, they needed me more than I ever needed them. The legal process took 6 weeks from the injunction to the partial reversal. The fraudulent transfer was unwound to the extent that the trust clause allowed, which meant the business license and interior rights to the studio space reverted to me completely, and the property sale itself was frozen pending an investigation into the document irregularities. Derek's investor group withdrew. They had not, their representatives explained in a letter I read 3 times, been informed of the contested elements of the title, and they were reserving the right to pursue their own claims against the parties who had sold them a compromised asset. My parents retained a separate attorney. They did not call me during those 6 weeks except once, near the end, when my mother left a message that was less a message than a verdict. She said I had destroyed this family, that she hoped I understood what I had done, that things could never be the same. I sat with that message for a long time. I played it again. I thought about the kitchen on the morning I had gone to confront them, my mother's preemptive composure, my father's word, clarified. I thought about every time I had been asked to want less so that Derek could want more, every time my grandfather's studio had been spoken of as a complication rather than a gift, every time I had been handed the role of the one who simply managed, who did not need, who could always start over. Then I called my mother back, and I told her, with the steadiness of someone who has already done the hardest part, I did not destroy this family. I just stopped letting you use me to hold it together. She did not respond. I think she was not prepared for a sentence that gave her nothing to argue with, and so she said goodbye and hung up, and I sat in the quiet of my apartment and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief of it, because it was grief, losing the version of your family you had always hoped they might become, something that could only be described as air, room, space that had not been there before. I went back to Greystone on a Tuesday in early spring, the kind of day where the light is still thin but the air has begun to carry the memory of warmth. The construction had been paused long enough that the north-facing windows had not been replaced. They were boarded temporarily, which meant the studio was dim and cold and smelled of damp wood and concrete dust instead of turpentine. Several of my grandfather's shelves were still along the east wall. His workbench was still in the back corner because it was bolted to the floor and no one had gotten around to removing it, and when I put my hand on it, I felt something so specific and so old that I had to stand still for a moment and simply breathe. I had brought a sketchbook. I did not plan it consciously. It was simply in my bag the way it was always in my bag, the way certain habits survive even the things that should stop them. I sat down in the floor in the corner where the light was best, and I opened it to the first clean page, and I held the pencil, and then I drew a single line, not toward anything in particular, just a line, moving across the white space with the particular confidence that comes not from certainty about where you are going, but from willingness to find out. They thought they were taking my future, But all they really did was give me my freedom.